She hid her illiteracy for 60 years, then one letter changed her entire life forever. Welcome back and enjoy the story. No one ever asked Sylvia what her favorite book was. She wouldn't have known what to say, not because she didn't love stories. In fact, her imagination was filled with them, but because Sylvia had never learned how to read, not even a little. Every morning, she would wake up and stare at the newspaper her husband left on the kitchen table. The bold headlines, nothing more than strange symbols dancing across the page. In her small apartment in Chicago, surrounded by books, she couldn't understand. Sylvia had mastered the art of pretending. At 79 years old, she had hidden her secret for so long that sometimes she almost believed her own act. Almost. Sylvia had grown up in a rural village outside of Chicago where girls were taught to cook, clean, and keep their voices small. At 7 years old, she stopped going to school to take care of her younger siblings. The memories of her brief time in the classroom were hazy now. The teacher's stern voice, the confusing letters on the chalkboard, the burning shame when she couldn't answer questions. By 11, she was cleaning houses in the wealthier parts of town. By 17, she was married to Thomas, a kind factory worker who never questioned why she always asked him to read everything aloud. And by 23, she had 3 children who never suspected that their mother couldn't read them bedtime stories. No one noticed that Sylvia couldn't read. She learned to hide it with clever tricks, memorizing bus routes by landmarks rather than street names, pretending to check grocery lists while actually counting items, watching cashiers closely to recognize numbers by color and shape. When someone handed her a form, she'd pat her pockets and say, "Oh, my glasses, I forgot them again," and laugh it off with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. If you're enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Thomas never knew about his wife's secret shame. Even as they built a life together in their modest Chicago apartment, raising 3 children and eventually welcoming grandchildren, Sylvia managed to keep her illiteracy hidden from everyone. She'd memorized the recipes she heard on the radio, instead of writing them down. When bills arrived, she'd recognize them by their envelopes and set them aside for Thomas to handle. She became so adept at hiding her inability to read that sometimes days would pass without the ache of inadequacy that usually lived in her chest. But there were moments when the weight of her secret felt unbearable. Like when her daughter, Lillian, brought home perfect report cards that Sylvia couldn't truly appreciate. Or when her son Michael published his first article in the Chicago Tribune and she had to pretend she'd read every word. She knew the shape of their names when written down. But beyond that, the letters remained incomprehensible marks on a page. The worst moments came when her grandchildren would climb onto her lap with colorful picture books, eyes wide with expectation, and she'd have to invent stories based on the illustrations while pretending to read the text. Each time, she promised herself she would learn someday, but shame and fear kept her prisoner, and someday never came. The neighborhood library stood just 3 blocks from her apartment, its grand stone steps and tall windows both inviting and terrifying. Sylvia would walk past it sometimes, slowing her pace to peek through the windows at the people inside, their faces peaceful as they turned pages and absorbed words she couldn't understand. What would it be like, she wondered, to unlock that? Magic? To hold a book and actually read it? To not feel panic rise in her throat when handed a piece of paper? What would it be like to be free? Could you imagine keeping such a profound secret from your loved ones for decades? The thought alone makes your heart race with anxiety. At church, Sylvia would pretend to read hymns, but would just mouth the words she'd memorized over years of attendance. At the grocery store, she bought only what she recognized by label: Campbell's soup with its distinctive red and white can, Wonder Bread in its polka dot packaging. when Thomas passed away suddenly from a heart attack and she had to sign paperwork. At the funeral home, she practiced her name over and over on a napkin before placing the pen on the line, her hand trembling not just from grief but from fear of making a mistake. Thomas had been her safety net, reading everything important to her under the guise of sharing, handling the paperwork of their life while she handled their home. Without him, every piece of mail became a potential crisis, every form a source of humiliation. Sylvia's daughter Lillian offered to move in to help her mother adjust to widowhood, but Sylvia refused. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," she insisted, fear rather than independence driving her decision. If Lillian lived with her, how long before her secret was exposed? So Sylvia remained alone in the apartment she'd shared with Thomas for 52 years, developing new strategies to navigate a text-filled world. She'd ask neighbors to read confusing notices from the building manager. She'd claim her eyesight was failing when bank tellers handed her documents. She memorized which button to press on the ATM to withdraw exactly $40. But as technology advanced and the world increasingly expected everyone to read and write with ease, Sylvia's clever workarounds became harder to maintain. The turning point came just as she was about to give up hope. Little did she know that a simple afternoon visit would crack open the shell she had built around herself for nearly 8 decades. She was 79 when it finally broke her. Her grandson, Emmanuel, 9 years old, came to visit with a crayon-written card in his hand, his face beaming with pride as he presented it to her. "I wrote you a letter," he said, standing in her kitchen with chocolate milk stains on his shirt and expectation in his eyes. Sylvia smiled, her heart already beginning to race. "How sweet. Read it to me," she said, using the strategy that had served her for decades. But Emmanuel shook his head, his smile growing wider. "No," he said firmly, "you read it. I wrote it just for you." She froze, panic seizing her chest like a vice. The cheerful kitchen with its yellow curtains and the smell of fresh cookies suddenly felt too small, too bright. Her hands trembled as she took the colorful paper, pretending to examine it while her mind raced for an excuse. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain Emmanuel could hear it. Her eyes welled up with tears she desperately tried to blink away. She laughed softly, the sound hollow even to her own ears. "Oh, Abuelita's eyes are tired today. Can you read it instead?" Emmanuel looked confused but nodded, taking back his creation. As he read aloud his message of love and a joke about his new puppy, Sylvia barely heard the words. All she could think was, what if he asks me again tomorrow? What if, someday soon, someone finally discovers my shameful secret? What happens when I can no longer hide? What will they think of me then? The walls of pretense she had carefully constructed over decades were beginning to crumble, and Sylvia had no idea how to hold them up anymore. Will she find the courage to face her greatest fear, or will she continue living in the shadows of shame? That night, after Emmanuel had gone home with Lillian, Sylvia sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the card her grandson had made. Bright colors, big letters, meaningless shapes that everyone else in the world could understand. But not her. She couldn't read a single word of her own grandson's message of love. The tears she had held back earlier now flowed freely down her wrinkled cheeks. For nearly 8 decades, she had carried the burden of her illiteracy like a heavy stone, building her entire life around hiding it. But Emmanuel's innocent request had shattered something inside her. In the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by the photographs of 3 generations of family who had no idea about her secret, Sylvia made a decision. The shame had stolen enough of her life. She was tired of pretending, tired of feeling less than, tired of the constant fear of being discovered. If not now, when? If not for herself, then for Emmanuel, who deserved a grandmother who could read his letters. The next morning, With her heart in her throat and Thomas's old sweater wrapped around her shoulders for courage, Sylvia walked the 4 blocks to the local community centre. She had passed by it for years, noting the colourful flyers. In the window, with a mixture of longing and trepidation, never brave enough to go in. Today was different. Today, her fear of remaining the same outweighed her fear of change. Inside the community centre, the walls were lined with announcements and schedules, all of them incomprehensible to Sylvia. She stood in the entrance, fighting the urge to turn around and flee back to the safety of her apartment. But then she spotted a flyer with large, bold letters and a picture of an open book. She couldn't read the words, but she recognized the image clearly enough. With trembling legs, she approached the front desk where a young woman with kind eyes and a bright smile greeted her. Sylvia clasped her hands together to stop them from shaking as she whispered the words that would change everything. "I want to learn to read." The young woman's smile widened, and she reached across the desk to lightly touch Sylvia's arm. "Of course," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that melted some of Sylvia's shame. "You've come to the right place. I'm Maria, and I'll help you get started." As Maria led her to a small office to fill out paperwork, Sylvia felt a curious mixture of terror and relief. For the first time in her life, she admitted her secret to another person, and the world hadn't ended. When Maria offered to read the forms aloud and help her complete them, Sylvia's eyes welled with grateful tears. "The class meets 3 times a week," Maria explained. "You'll be working with Ms. Jenkins. She's wonderful with adult learners." Adult learners. The phrase made Sylvia feel less alone. There were others like her. She wasn't the only one. It wasn't easy. The classroom was small and intimate, with just 6 other students, but Sylvia still felt exposed. The letters danced and jumbled before her eyes, refusing to make sense. Her fingers fumbled with pencils, uncomfortable and awkward after decades of avoiding them. She felt embarrassed sitting next to people decades younger, all of whom seemed to be progressing faster than she was. After the first week, she almost quit. After the second week, she cried herself to sleep, convinced she was too old, too set in her ways to learn something children mastered before losing their baby teeth. But Miss Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher with silver hair and endless patience, wouldn't let her give up. "You've been brave for decades, Sylvia," she said during one particularly frustrating session. "Be brave for just a little longer." Slowly, painfully, something began to change. The letter S became familiar, the first letter of her name. She practiced writing it over and over, marveling at how the simple curve could represent her. Then came Y and L, and V and I and A. She learned how to spell her name, then her children's names, Lillian, Michael, and Patricia, then her grandchildren's names, Emmanuel, Sarah, Jason, and Lucy. Ms. Jenkins taught her words like love, sunlight, brave, simple words with profound meanings that Sylvia could now recognize on the page. Every night she practiced with an old workbook, tracing letters by lamplight the way her children once did, her arthritis-knotted fingers aching but determined. Have you ever kept a secret that felt too big to share, or known someone who transformed their life when most people would say it was too late? Share your thoughts in the comments. 3 months into her lessons, Sylvia found herself staring at the bus schedule, something that had always been indecipherable to her. She squinted, focusing on the numbers and letters. "Number 7, she whispered to herself. Oak Park. She looked again, hardly daring to believe. Arrives 2:30. She had read it. Actually read it, not just memorized it. She cried right there at the bus stop, not caring who saw her tears. That evening, she called Lillian. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Can you come over tomorrow? Bring Emmanuel." The time had come to share her journey. She couldn't bear keeping this secret from them any longer. Not the shame of her illiteracy, but the pride of her progress. When they arrived the next day, Sylvia sat them down at her kitchen table, where 3 cups of hot chocolate waited. "I have something to show you," she said, pulling out a children's book she had borrowed from the community centre. Emmanuel's eyes widened in surprise as his grandmother opened the book and began to read aloud. Her voice was halting, and she stumbled over some words, but she was reading, actually reading. Lillian's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned. "Mom," she whispered, tears filling her eyes, "I never knew." Sylvia looked up from the book, her chin raised with newfound dignity. "For 60 years, I couldn't read. Not a single word. But now, I'm learning." That afternoon marked the beginning of a new chapter for their family. Emmanuel brought his homework to show his grandmother, no longer asking her to read to him but reading with her, the 2 of them sounding out difficult words together. Lillian joined her mother for weekly library visits. Michael and Patricia expressed their amazement and support when told the news. For the first time in her life, Sylvia's family saw her completely, not just the capable mother and grandmother she had always been, but also the courageous woman who had decided that 7 decades of shame was enough. 6 months into her lessons, Ms. Jenkins gave the class a special assignment: write a letter to someone who changed your life. The other students immediately began writing, their pencils scratching across paper with confidence that still eluded Sylvia. She sat for hours with her pencil in hand, thinking about who had changed her life. Was it Maria at the front desk, who had welcomed her without judgment? Miss Jenkins, who had shown her infinite patience? Or was it Emmanuel, whose innocent request had cracked open her carefully constructed facade? As the afternoon light faded into evening, Sylvia began to write. Slowly, deliberately, with painstaking care, she formed each letter. And then she wrote, "Dear Emmanuel, you gave me something no one else ever did. You believed in me without knowing it. I used to be afraid of words. Now I welcome them like old friends. Thank you for writing to me. This is my first letter back. I hope you'll keep reading, and one day we'll read together. Love, Abuelita." When she finished, her hand was cramped and her eyes were tired, but her heart felt lighter than it had in decades. She folded the paper carefully, placed it in an envelope, addressed it with her grandson's name, and sealed it with a kiss. The letter wasn't perfect. Some letters were shaky, and she had misspelled several words that Miss Jenkins quietly corrected before Sylvia rewrote them. But it was hers, words formed by her own hand, expressing thoughts from her own heart, words she could now read back to herself. Will Sylvia's courage to reveal her journey inspire others around her? And what doors will her newfound literacy open in the twilight years of her life? When Emmanuel received the letter in the mail, 3 days later, he ran to his mother, screaming, "Abuelita wrote to me, with real writing." Lillian, who had been helping her mother practice in secret during their weekly visits, smiled at her son's excitement. "Why don't you take it with you when we visit her this weekend?" she suggested. "I think she'd love to hear you read it." That Saturday, Emmanuel burst into Sylvia's apartment, waving the letter like a victory flag. "Abuelita, I got your letter," he announced, throwing his arms around her waist. Sylvia hugged him back, her eyes meeting Lillian's over the boy's head in a moment of shared understanding. Emmanuel pulled away and held up the letter, slightly crumpled from his enthusiastic handling. "Will you read it to me?" he asked, his voice suddenly shy. The request, so similar to the one that had catalyzed her journey months ago, made Sylvia's heart skip. But this time, instead of panic, she felt a surge of determination. She took the letter in trembling hands and unfolded it carefully. The words she had written looked back at her, familiar friends now rather than indecipherable enemies. And she read every single word. Her voice cracked on "afraid," her eyes blurred at "welcome them like old friends." But she read it, all of it, as Emmanuel and Lillian listened in reverent silence. When she finished, Emmanuel hugged her so tightly she thought her heart would burst with love and pride. "You did it," he whispered against her shoulder. And for the first time in her life, Sylvia believed she was smart. Not because the world said so, but because she had proven it to herself. In the months that followed, Sylvia's world expanded in ways she had never imagined possible. She kept learning, advancing from children's books to short stories for young adults. Ms. Jenkins introduced her to the public library, where she received her first library card at the age of 80. The librarian, a kind woman named Eleanor, who quickly became a friend, helped her find books that matched her reading level while challenging her to grow. "Reading is like a muscle," Eleanor explained. "The more you use it, the stronger it gets." And Sylvia was determined to strengthen hers. By her 81st birthday, she had read her first full-length book, a slim novel about a girl who learned to fly. "I know how she feels," Sylvia told Ms. Jenkins during their weekly check-in. "I'm finally free." But perhaps the most profound changes were happening within her family. Once a month, Sylvia hosted what they called Reading Sunday, where 3 generations gathered in her apartment to share books and stories. Michael would bring newspaper articles he thought would interest her. Patricia brought poetry. Lillian helped her mother tackle more challenging texts. And the grandchildren took turns reading aloud with their grandmother, patiently helping her sound out difficult words. Emmanuel, especially, took pride in his role as his grandmother's reading partner. "We're learning together," he would tell anyone who would listen. For her part, Sylvia no longer felt the need to hide. When she struggled with a word or misunderstood a passage, she asked for help without shame. "I spent 60 years pretending to know," she explained to her family. "Now I get to spend the rest of my life actually learning." As her second year of literacy education approached its end, Sylvia faced her biggest challenge yet. The community centre was hosting a literacy awareness fundraiser, and Ms. Jenkins had asked if Sylvia would consider sharing her story. The thought of standing before a crowd, admitting her decades of illiteracy, and reading aloud made her stomach churn with anxiety. But then she thought of all the others, those who, like her former self, lived in constant fear of exposure, people who developed elaborate strategies to hide their inability to read, people who felt shame where they should feel only determination to learn. "Yes," she told Miss Jenkins, "I'll do it." For weeks she practiced her speech. Lillian helped her write it, but Sylvia insisted on reading it herself during the event. On the night of the fundraiser, the community centre was packed with local officials, donors, educators, and students from the literacy program. Sylvia sat in the front row, her family surrounding her like a protective shield, her hands clutching the 3 pages of her speech so tightly the paper crinkled. When Ms. Jenkins called her name, Sylvia rose on unsteady legs and made her way to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most not, and felt a moment of panic. Then her eyes found Emmanuel, who gave her a thumbs up and a wide smile. Taking a deep breath, she began to read. "My name is Sylvia Martinez," she started, her voice quavering slightly before finding its strength. "For 60 years, I couldn't read a single word. Not a street sign, not a recipe book, not a birthday card from my grandson." She paused, looking up from her paper to meet the eyes of her audience. "I was 7 years old when I left school to care for my siblings. By 11, I was cleaning houses. By 17, I was married. No one noticed that I couldn't read. I became very good at hiding it." As she continued, her voice grew steadier, more confident. She described the elaborate strategies she had developed to navigate a text-filled world. She spoke of the isolation of her secret shame, the constant fear of discovery. And then she recounted the turning point, Emmanuel's innocent request that she read his card the moment she decided enough was enough. At 79 years old, I walked into this community center and whispered the words that changed my life. I want to learn to read. By the time she finished her speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The audience rose in a standing ovation, their applause washing over Sylvia like a wave of validation. In that moment, standing behind the podium with tears of joy streaming down her face, Sylvia realized that her greatest shame had become her greatest triumph. The secret that had once imprisoned her had been transformed into a story of hope and courage that might inspire others. When a local reporter asked to interview her for the Chicago Tribune, Sylvia agreed without hesitation. If my story helps even one person feel less alone, less ashamed, then every difficult moment was worth it, she told the journalist. The resulting article, titled, "It's Never Too Late, Chicago Grandmother Learns to Read at 79, spread Sylvia's story far beyond the community center walls. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.